Thank you once again, Professor Lee, for this invitation, providing me with an opportunity to introduce myself. Also, for the opportunity that I will address what should be a desirable sort of a direction for Korean studies overall in the course of my talk. Before I go into detail, the cover of the book, that's the cover of my book, that's the early 1970s of Apgujeongdo in Gangnam, Seoul. So below the farmer in Western clothing flying, now the above is a modern Apgujeong apartment complex, still there actually, that complex still there. So contrast between modernity and tradition in South Korea. So, although when nicely summarized the gist of my arguments, it's worth it on my part to repeat what the book is all about. Okay, so the paradox, as Grant said, is Korean modern economic development. Still, Korean society remains very much traditional in my view. So, but on the other hand, the Korean intellectuals and many, outsiders still expected the emergence of modern society corresponding to the level of economic development. So I've been trying to understand what is so distinctive, if not unique, about Korean society. Particularly, since I began teaching at Seoul National in 1986, I was so much, let's say, not only curious but repugnant to the overwhelming tendency in Korean academia by borrowing Western frameworks, trying to apply them to the understanding of Korean society. To me, I could not accept that kind of a pervasive Western orientation-based kind of Korean studies. So at the time, I was known to be Soviet specialist, Sovietology, what they call. As Mr. Lin well aware, I taught Soviet politics along with the Korean issues, but then what's the connection between my studies of Soviet Union and my interest in Korea? I studied the Stalin period very closely to find out that the more Stalin pursued rapid industrialization, the more he had to rely on tradition. That is what they call paradox. And the only paradox from Western modernization theory perspective, in other words. Normally, the first generation of modernization theory in the West used to argue that with modernization, tradition sort of subsides or disappears. Okay? But then that paradigm has been now denied for a number of years, replaced by the second generation of modernization theory, where they acknowledge the role of tradition. But then there's no single case study where they specifically demonstrate how tradition actually works in the context of industrialization. So I dare to claim that my book is a first of its kind in empirically demonstrating how tradition works to give rise to a certain pattern of social change in a country like South Korea. Okay? So the ultimate social consequences of state-led industrialization, late industrialization in South Korea by calling neo-feminism. Okay? The neo-feminism, in other words, is kind of a persistence of, or rather reinforcement of our traditional ties in spite of industrialization. Why I say in spite? Because as I said, Western modern theory presupposes the tradition would disappear. On the contrary, in the South Korean case, it's the reinforce. That's why I said the sort of paradox or the some sort. So this paradox, many Korean scholars and mass media take them for granted without explaining them. Okay? So in Korean language, Korean social science fields, they don't deal with the pronunciation. There are too many pronunciations which are not explained in Korean society. Pronoun in English self-evident. So it's so self-evident that they don't explain it. That itself constitutes a paradox, okay, in Korean context. So in my book, I try to demonstrate how Korean style of late industrialization actually reinforced why Korean style industrialization had to bring back Korean traditions in the process of industrialization to create distinctive social changing patterns in South Korea. So at outset, I would like to emphasize the fact that I don't subscribe myself to generalization. I subscribe myself to more contextualization approach to Korean social science in general. This morning I had a very interesting intellectual discourse with Professor Koka. We totally agree on the need for contextualization of historical facts. So as I said earlier, intellectual environment for South Korea in the 1980s was they tried to import whatever theories, frameworks developed from the West, so that the distinctive and unique aspects of Korean society remain in a residual category, rather than not explained. So second background is that there's too much theories, explanations of studies on political economy, where the role of state has been highly emphasized in developing economy. While what happened to Korean society in the aftermath of this kind of strong role of state remains totally unexplained, right? So that instead, either American conservative sociological framework or the class theory, Marxian perspective, indiscriminately applied to the understanding of a Korean society. Here I propose an alternative to the understanding of Korean society in the aftermath of a rapid late industrialization. Okay? So in American sociology, political economy became very fashionable since 1970s. But then, as I said here, they brought what they call state back in, like a famous Scotch book's title said, bring the state back in. But they brought the state only to the level of political economy, not to the level of political economy, I mean sociology. So my book is an attempt to fill the gap between this basic political economy studies and the poverty of study of social change. Okay? All right. So, and then again, the last item there, I do not commit myself to universal consequences of industrialization. I think we need to pattern types of industrialization. Depending upon the types of industrialization, we should expect the different social consequences. That's the basic tenets of my arguments here. All right, let's go next. So once I already explained modernist theory, some problems. Okay. Now tradition. The tradition is a very hazy concept, a slippery concept. It's not easy to handle, right? It's not easy to grasp the tradition. But then the way they treated the tradition, to me, has been misleading us. Tradition should not be mystified in any sense. I will define tradition basically in terms of institutions and values. Okay, so I maintain my book, no adequate theory of social change beyond the theories that claim universal social consequences of industrialization. So the role of tradition, the study of it, actually is left in theoretical limbo. Okay? I don't, in other words, I don't presume or prematurely assume any structural social consequences of industrialization. My position is that we need to be contextualized in detail to understand what kind of society will come out of a certain type of industrialization. Okay, and so instead of a class or a stratum or anything, I use the term human grouping patterns in a more neutral sense. So, meaning assuming that different contexts of industrialization will bring about different patterns of social change. Okay? So we tend to almost all semi-automatically the tendency to link industrialization to class society. To me, I resent it. I challenge that kind of assumption. Okay? And then, in terms of Korean studies, I wrote this book with the concept of de-provincializing Korean studies abroad. In other words, by de-provincializing Korean studies, I mean Korea has ceased to be a target for introduction. Korea no longer needs to be introduced. Korea needs to be studied, more or less an equal comparison to any other cases of modernization. So I think the Korean studies now has just entered different stage of de-provincializing. Okay? So then the core of de-provincializing actually involves comparative perspective. So this book is about how to put Korea's experiences of modernization into more broader comparative perspective. Okay. So this is more sort of a more clear representation of my intention. In the past, in the context of political economy studies, so on the right, number one, they assume let's say what they call embedded autonomy, meaning Korea and Japan, actually, there's a lot of connections between state and society through school ties, regional ties, whatever. But then state never got totally corrupted by these ties, tried to maintain some autonomy, and then based upon that autonomy, they were able to implement the economic policies for success. Okay, but then that's why their understanding of the state in that context is very functional, meaning they're only interested in explaining the role of state for economic development, right? But my concern is that then, does the state remain same throughout the industrialization? Okay? In other words, does or does not the state change over time? Or what happens to society then through this interaction between state and society for economic development? So I'm interested in the second, the picture here. Okay, so what happened to society through the interactions between state and economy? Right? What happened to the state itself? So later on, I will make an argument or observation that, as I discussed with the just Coca this morning. Bavarian thesis that the industrialization brings about bureaucratization does not apply to Korea at all. In fact, as here some bureaucrats, ambassador here will understand it, because I lectured in front of many public servants in Korea. They fully agree with me. That is, in the case of South Korea, unlike the Bavarian thesis, industrialization brought about de-bureaucratization of Korean bureaucracy, meaning Korean bureaucracy lost its bureaucratic elements in spite of industrialization. Okay, so then how late industrialization starts in terms of social change. First thing is any elite group should start feeling sense of inferiority vis-a-vis Japan, vis-a-vis Germany, vis-a-vis America, whatever. If you look at the Bismarck, actually in the German history, strong inferiority over Great Britain and France is there. Stalin, strong sense of inferiority over the Western part. Japan obviously felt inferior to Germany. I remember the Okubo, who visited Germany, once remarked, even German hens lay much more number of eggs than Japanese counterparts. So sense of inferiority was there, clearly there. Without this kind of existence of certain group of elites beginning to feed inferiority, no beginning of any late industrialization. That's the first point. Second point, feeling inferiority should not remain as such. It should be related to sense of urgency. So remember Korean phenomenon 빨리빨리. This relates to this sense of urgency. So then the sense of urgency actually in turn it develops into sense of ambitiousness in planning and implementation. So if you look at the Soviet Union, even Russia and Japan, Korea, even China, it's so striking to observe that for the first few years, at least close to, if not more, about 10% growth on average. If you look at any case, in late coming cases, okay? So why? Because they are in a hurry. They want to politically, economically, they want to demonstrate the early sense of a success, particularly for Park Chung in South Korea, for his own political legitimacy. He had to. Yeah. That's why at the beginning of a successful stage, they demonstrate some big buildings, large scale bridges. If you go to a Podong area in Shanghai, you know why there are high buildings? That's a demonstration effect for all citizens. So to convince people that we're succeeding, kind of thing. Okay. And then state it's well done. Political economic study is ample evidence about allocating positive incentives to enterprises by the state. So that's fourth item. Then ultimately, what comes out of this relationship? Total dependency, high degree of dependency of the business and society on the state. As Dahrendorf clearly explains in the case of Germany, where how the state actually nourished the German business sectors and the society with the social power something. So to me, in terms of understanding society in general, we have to be very aware this level of dependency on the state, not only among the business, but also on the part of society in general. So let me give you an example of how Park Chung felt a sense of urgency. You see, look at the last. There are numerous examples. So I can provide tons of evidence expressed by President Park in terms of the sense of urgency. So we spent most of our time on whatever the forbidden. Here, okay. Infighting. Fratricidal infighting. It was a history of microcosm of the feudal society, which was not characterized by idleness, remissness, and stagnation. In other words, numerous sense of backwardness by Park Chung-hee like this. Also, another example would be sense of urgency. You see, we cannot continue to live like this, and if we do so, we are about to starve to death or to face the collapse of the country. What more do you need to demonstrate the sense of urgency? Right? So then, out of sense of urgency, what? Ambitiousness. Look at this. You see the original target for the first economic 5-year economic plan, 71%, but actually end up at 8.3%, indicating how ambitious that plan was. Okay. But then second 5-year plan, much more, 11.4%. Original plan was 7.0%. See, it's almost like Soviet. I was struck by the similarity. Right? So the same pattern. So as remember, sense of the inferiority, sense of urgency, sense of ambition. And this is the general sort of makeups of lateness orientations. Look at this. This is a graphic presentation of how fast credit economy had developed. So in the case of England, it took more than 2.5 centuries for agriculture to change to 4% return structure out of 40. See? But in Korea, look at, within the short period of time, 1 generation, similar pattern. So it's how contracted Korean style industrialization was. You can easily see that right there. Then I usually say to my students, what happened to you speed up on the highway? In other words, if you hurry in a hurry, something happens. That negative happens, okay? So we'll go to that negative consequences. Okay. Now, this is ambitious, you see. So every year, the original target upgraded as an indication for ambitiousness, okay? By 30%, 27%. Look at this. How many percentage they increase original target? Okay? Yeah. So now, what would be institutional makeup of institutional imperatives of latent industrialization? This to me very very important. So the first proposition that I throw out is that the more late, the more sense of urgency, and the more likelihood to rely on tradition. That's why. Why rely on tradition? Because people are familiar with the tradition. So if, for example, in the case of Japan, Fukudake, for example, drew upon Japan case, the way they recruit the factory girls, they all the time recruit the same girls from same villages. Okay, why? Familiarity. It's easy to communicate, easy to interact. So tradition plays a very positive role in familiarizing people with industrialization, or even in factory conflict, something like that. Okay? So I think it's very important to regurgitate, repeat the things. The more the late, the more tradition. So then the people they are very vague about what tradition means. Many Koreans, they are not able to make a distinction between traditional and tradition. Okay? Traditionalism, as I quoting Pelikan, which I totally agree, tradition is a living faith of the dead. Okay? So past coming back alive to the present, that's a tradition. Traditional is, on the contrary, the death faith of the living. Those who wanted to go back to the past. I think Korean. If I have opportunity, I would like to explain why there is a confusion of a tradition in Korean study now. But here it suffices to say here that the death faith of the living, that's the prevalent perception of tradition among Korean people. Yeah. Okay? So we should be very I want to make clear about the distinction between tradition and traditional. Okay, that's a totally different things. But then, as I said, I define tradition very in a simple terms. That in terms of institution values. For example, filial piety. Everyone knows about filial piety, right? Institutionally, for example, government. Let's say I remember back used to provide the housing priority to those who live with their parents, for example, right? That's the institution, law, policies and laws, something like that. Even in China, I remember back several years ago, Chinese government they promulgated a law which forces people to visit their parents once annually. Their parents can. That's an institution. Bell is about education, for example. I mean, we throughout our elementary school, middle school years, we have been indoctrinated with the value about the Philippine. So I divide up the tradition in terms of institution and values. Okay? But then there are two modes of how to strategize traditional institution values. So far as I'm concerned, two modes of taking advantage of the or reinventing tradition for the purpose of late industrialization. Harnessing strategy versus invention strategy. Harnessing means opportunistic, partial, uneven accommodation of tradition. Versus reinvention is comprehensive, strategic, encompassing way of inventing tradition. That's a Japanese. Persia, what about Persia? Persia is a very unique, exceptional case because of the existence of Yong-Chool class. This is the born and beyond the east here. This is the birthplace of the Yong-Chool class, as we all know. I mean, so Yong-Chool, that's why Persia case stands out. Why? Japan, Korea share the similarity, although for different reasons. In Japan, samurai themselves turned into modern sort of the actors, the initiators of modernization, meaning no longer past actually affecting the present in Japan. In Korea, for different reasons, but Korean Yangban class actually almost destroyed, decimated because of colonial. So conditions are very similar, structurally speaking, although with a different contents. In other words, no opposition group to industrialization, either Japan or, but in Persia, strong opposition forces like Yong-Chool class. That's the distinctly different case of Persia. Okay? Soviet Union, although a lot of sacrifice. I mean, Stalin killed more than 20 million people of rich peasants. But then, nevertheless, structurally, when Stalin initiated industrialization, no opposing forces. Okay? Likewise, China, same thing. For different reasons, Mao didn't drop out the Persian elements to Taiwan. So India stands out. India, to me, is quite distinctly different. Why? Still caste system. That's why I don't expect too much the speedy industrialization in India because. So if you look at the successful industrialization of all of the world, strikingly similar is the fact that there's no visible opposing social elements to industrialization. That's why Prussia is. But as you know, that's why Bismarck had a hard time in balancing between industry and agriculture, as it is represented by policy of rye and the iron something. Okay. All right. But then, based on this tradition, but then top leaders need bureaucrats. I mean, the people to help them out. Two conditions. One is knowledge. The other is loyalty. Competent and then loyal. It's not easy to get to fulfill to be required. It's not easy in any case. I'm sure Persian bureaucracy they started the merit-based recruitment in Philippine period on, and then Korea case have a long tradition of civil service elimination. like Emerson Lim took a very difficult examination himself here, and I did myself too, but I quit on that game. I couldn't stand the bureaucracy. I couldn't understand why bureaucrats should sit down at the desk for nine hours per day, 8 hours per day. I couldn't understand it. I mean, I quit it at 5 days. And so in each case, without having both competent loyal people, it's not easy to accomplish rapid industrialization. Okay. Then point here is, depending upon what kinds of modes of recruitment a leader takes, that will in turn affect the rest of society. Okay? So in other words, here, my point is, in order to understand social change of industrialization, you should be very specific about the process of interaction between state and society, rather than imposing class framework upon Korean society or any other society. Okay, I was very reluctant to admit or they agree or go along with the Korean social sociologists where they try to import the Western framework to understand Korea. Even now, Korean foreign policy or the West policies now are being made without knowing their own society fully. That's my premise of Korean studies. Okay? So, to repeat, because it's important, modes of implementation and pattern of recruitment affect patterns of social groupings. Okay, distinct social needs beyond class. Okay? So, do not assume automatically industrialization brings about class-based society. That's my kind of argument. But then, based upon how the state recruits the bureaucrats, that will in turn affect the state, business sector. So let's go on then. Let me go back to here. I'll come back here. Look at this. Yeah, here we all know the Jebel is an economic entity, but Jebel is not is beyond the economy. Jebel is about Korean society as a whole. Okay, so I'm looking at Jebel from sociological perspective. So we need the sociology of Jebel, not sociology of political economy. So ownership, basically family type, right? Ownership. Management is, as I'll be demonstrating momentarily, there's a regional and school type managers. Workers, regional type only, basically. So these are the kind of a microcosm. Jebel is kind of microcosm of Korean society, right? We should go beyond the political economy. That's why I kept emphasizing how to go beyond the political economy. But to understand social change, of course, we should know political economy. So that's why what complicates the process of understanding social change is that we should know everything about it. That's why, frankly, it took so many years to complete this book. So my excuse about this. Let's go back to now recruitment. Look at this, right? So what's so unique, or I would say the intriguing about Park's recruitment pattern is combination of merit and regional types. Okay, yeah. Many public administration, the people usually based upon this merit side of Korean side. But what is so intriguing, what has been hidden so far is combination of merit and regional ties. So sometimes school ties too, but so in personnel changes, priority was given to both competence and loyalty. Loyalty based upon regional ties here. Okay, right. So this raises the interesting question: whether Park Jae-in deliberately the attempt to create the regionalism in Korea. Many people say no. To me, it's kind of unintended consequence of Park Jae-in style of industrialization. Okay, all right. So more graphically here, look at this. So in terms of region, by the time of 1979, look at this, Southeastern people comprised of almost 50% of the higher bureaucrats, okay? While Southerners, only 19%, okay? And then let's go on. And then merit-based, we have factor. It's interesting. SNU factor, Southeastern, 41%, right? And while Southwestern, 10%, something like that, okay? Yeah. So you see the contrast here, okay? Over time. Yeah. Here I want to mention, I close examined what happened on the Sungmanri. On the Sungmanri, evenly distributed. In terms of population proportion, evenly distributed. But only that began to happen on the Bakchang. Okay? And then at the business sector, then what happened to the business sector? Here, as I mentioned earlier, business people emulate state personnel policy. State policy. Okay, so 42, almost 43% among the bureaucrats above department chief in 1980, Seoul National Projects, whereas 5.6% and 7.3% came from Yonsei and Korea University. Okay, but then how about the company level? Similar pattern. 35% to 35% Seoul National, and respectively 7-8% from Yonsei Korean University. Okay, so this is what I call emulative behavior on the part of business of the state personnel policy. Why? Because the state provided plenty of incentives. So to get an access to state incentives, they need to emulate state personnel policies. Okay? And then you may feel bored by now, but let me go on to next. I already explained this. That what I'm saying there is that at the managerial level at Zebos, actually regional tie is very high. I simply translate it into figures, numbers, so I don't want to do too much about it. So let me explain the entire process here. Okay, so it's kind of summing up here. Social change, we should observe, understand the process of interactions of late industrialization and tradition, not as consequences. In other words, we tend to assume automatically ultimate result of social consequence in terms of class without understanding specific process of industrialization. So, although there are many variations in class analysis, they have never given up class itself. I dare to propose that we should go beyond that. So Park's sense of urgency, backwardness, inferiority, sense of urgency, and ambitiousness is well known. Park's need for both competent, reliable people for economic development, we should understand. Following emulation by Jebels and the rest of society, that's what I call isomorphism. I'm sure Professor Yang knows about isomorphism very much. So, in other words, emulation. Jebels' use of blood, regional, and school ties to secure access to state incentives. There we now begin to see emergence of neo-families. In other words, the reinforced patterns of blood, regional school ties, I call it neo-feminism. Why neo? Because it happened in the context of the modern industrialization. Okay, it's different from previous the blood relationship, feminism only. It's a combination of all three. So neo-feminism, in other words, unintended consequences of use of the previous in Park Chan style of industrialization. Okay? So then how? The next point is very important. How then this neo-feminism trickle down to the rest of society, right? That's important. First important mechanism is the relationship between Jebel and small medium industry. Okay? So I interviewed the many owners of the small medium industry. I thought they would resent this new families at the several level. No, actually, they eagerly so much wanted to have new families for their own survival. Okay? So I found that this nexus between travel and small business is a core aspect of the scaling down of new families. Also, another factor is the Jabol's managerial levels of middle class people. Okay, so the bulk of Korean middle class came from Jabol managerial class in Korea. I put the specific number in my book. So these two mechanisms, those Jabol's high manager level constituted the largest proportion of middle class, and also small middle class, and then Jabol nexus. These are two mechanisms where new families are trickled down from the state to the rest of society. This is the way I understand Korean society. Then, because of these new familiarism happen, what kind of distinctive social phenomenon we can find out and understand? First of all, once again, I'm sure you may feel bored if I repeat this, but I wanted to repeat this. We should challenge universal social consequences of industrialization. Okay, as Professor Koka's famous book on middle class indicates, Korean middle class is not regular middle class like what happened in Great Britain. No, they're strongly state dependent. They are not autonomous. They are not core of the civil society in Korea. So very state dependent people. So let me first go about, let's say, in my book, then I hate to say this, but I was the first person who traced where high school ties started in Korean history. I remember as a privileged advantage of being Seoul National faculty was to talk to prominent scholars in every discipline. So I was very much a beneficiary of that. But once I talked to very prominent Korean historian, Professor something, I don't remember his name, but I want to trace the origin of Korean high school. He said, why? Then I need it. Then he said, oh, Professor, don't care too much about school ties. School ties in Korean history started from Three Kingdom age, so don't know. Just he praised, brush up my interest. So at the end of lunch, I told him, by the way, Professor, I don't think there was high school during Three Kingdom. In other words, something must be explained. My contemporaries and beyond or below, we all know Korean high school ties prominently worked in Korean. Then nobody tried to explain origins. I feel ashamed of the fact that I was first one who at least tried to do it. So I spent 11 years in understanding colonial because of it. Then indeed, I even visited Japan so many times, and then tried to understand Japanese society. Then high school ties is there, of course, in Japan, but not as much as in South Korea. Only among 9 elite high schools, high school ties very strong in Korea. In Korea and Japan, in Korea, even vocational schools, very, very strong. Why? Because under the colonial rule, high school students was the main backbone of anti-Japanese independent movement. Okay? So I traced their triumphs and police records, how they tried to meet among themselves in secret to avoid the police eye something. In other words, police actually follow them very closely, but then they try to avoid them, and then to plot on their student activities against Japanese colonial rule. And I hypothesize that's the reason why high school ties began to develop. in South Korea. Okay, so you may challenge that, but at least it's first attempt. Okay, right. Then I began to understand what happened to Korean tradition during colonial period. Aha, that's a very critically important one, even now. Why? The critical distinction here between Japan and Korea is the fact that there is a strong continuity in Japan while strong disruption in Korean history. Okay? In other words, many people in America, particularly Western social science, think that Japan and Korea is the second image of Japan. No, absolutely nonsense. I'm not saying this because I'm Korean national. I think I am saying this because that's the beginning in order to understand where to go, to understand the base fundamental differences between Japan and Korea. At least from my point of view, what happened to Korean tradition during colonial period. To me, that's the beginning of understanding fundamental differences between Japan and Korea. So, from that perspective, I think whether Korea was economic expert or not, to me, is secondary. Why? Whether you live under colonial rule or not, you have to survive, frankly. So development exploitation to me, of course, more exploitation, but still some development. I don't deny it, frankly. Okay? In fact, if you deny that fact, internationally, Korean scholars do not stand, frankly. So, but I want to go beyond the economy. I want to look at what happened to contribution during colonial period. For example, here's Yang Yona at the Seoul National University Law School. She traced the family law in Korean society, and she made interesting observation. By the time of liberation, Korean scholars didn't know what was the traditional practice of Korean family because of so much the infusion of Japanese elements in Korean the civil law, right? So let's say, for example, divorce law. She studied. Sometimes Japanese system, sometimes conventional, traditional, the custom, other times mixture of both different tradition. So all of a sudden, identity became so blurred at the time of liberation. Okay. So to me, the fact that the Korean tradition was kind of lost in a sense in the colonial period, still affecting us in Korean society now. Okay. So to me, frankly, economic development exploitation issue is almost end. Why? Now Korea is now superseding Japan in terms of economy. So to me, that issue almost there's no sense in pursuing that argument, domestically or internationally. But to understand what happened to tradition during colonial world, to me, is still affecting us, even now. I will explain to you, if time permits, why Korea is suffering from great chaos even now. Okay? Exactly because of the loss of tradition, so lack of a community based on tradition. To me, that's the fundamental source of chaos in French right now. Okay? And then, second thing is I developed. It's a political science now. State-society relationship in American Western social sciences. To me, it's only one type, meaning how society challenges state. So what I call society versus state model. That's what we usually learn. No, I said I classify four different patterns of state-society relationship based on my book. I don't compare myself to state versus society model in Korea. Also, in the case of the Africa, state is a model. State kind of captured by society in Africa, so state cannot function properly. In the Western Europe, Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, state over society model. So state actually swallowed the society. Sort of a by analogy, I usually say snake swallowed the much bigger the entity than itself. So very bloated out to the kind of stomach image. That's the state over society model. But Korea case or Japan case, state and or state with the society. Okay. So as I said earlier, Korean social scientists blindly apply state versus society model to Korea. As if society challenges state all the time, largely based upon candlelight demonstrations, something like that. Okay. I found a very interesting concept based upon Montenegro study, where they said they call the term instant democracy. I like the term. Instant civil society, instant democracy, only at the time of candlelight demonstration. Okay? Once demonstration over, nothing. Okay. Let me give you an example. I remember back, I'm sure you most remember that at the end of candlelight, for example, to drive out the Parkman, French television actually carried a report that streets are so clean at the end of the 1 million people demonstrating something. I said it's a balloon. I think it's a kind of, it's not true. It's not real. If indeed more than 1 million people gather, there should be trash all over. That's natural. That's human. Okay. Indeed, a few days later, after the demonstration, new building opened up. At the end of the daily meeting, tons of trash all around the building. That's real. That's natural. In America, for example, on the street, not many people throwing out trash. But when they go to baseball stadium, a lot of trash. Okay. In other words, somebody swept the garbage and then demonstrating, it's a sign of suicide. That's simply silly, simply laughing man. To me, that's the indicator of suicide? No, that's the indicator of artificial instant of democracy. Okay, so am I being so cynical? I need to be, frankly. Okay, so allow me, forgive me, cynical. Sometimes, without being cynical, I can understand sort of current society. Forgive me about it. Okay? So that's the point. Okay, so the second point I was explaining. Industrialization that did not bring about privatization. What I call hollowed out bureaucracy. Okay. Why? Korean bureaucracy constantly impeded or infiltrated by business and other people through new familiar terms. So that the Korean bureaucracy hollowed out, losing whatever the remaining bureaucratic elements inside. So that's why Korean bureaucracy to me no longer bureaucratic enough. I think Korean bureaucracy is very weak, and now with the democratization for the politicized even, we're given the de-bureaucratized structure now for politicized. So that works, in fact, in Korean bureaucracy. Okay? Then, okay, so civil society formation and then ties to middle class. As I said, middle class is not middle class like in Max Weber characterized Great Britain middle class versus even German middle class. Yes, it's I agree with the Max Weber and then Koka about their characterization of German middle class. Then, not now, but then. Okay? So it's very much subjective to state influence, basically. Okay? Likewise, Korean middle class is not same as Western middle class, like Great Britain or American style. Okay? And so once again, Korean scholars should not blindly apply Western paradigms to Korea case. And then democratic consolidation. Look at it. This is a typical example of political science without sociology. Typically, they say, if presidential election or power transition happens over time peacefully, that's an indication of democratic consolidation. Look at Korea, what happened? 7 or 8 times of peaceful transition after democracy still is on thing. How to explain this? That's why my main challenge to American social science now is American social science has been going on without sociology, particularly political science. Okay? So I really think that without understanding Korean society, Korean social change, to blindly apply Western transitology, democratic consolidation theory to Korea, actually, as you see now, total failure. Okay? Also, more important thing to follow. Many people say Korean society become more individualistic, total nonsense. I coined the term privatism rather than individualism. In other words, individualism is distinct Western cultural civilization or legacy, rather than the Asian conflict. Individualism took more than several centuries to develop in Western conflict, starting from the religious reform, so sort of the Lutheran, and then anyhow, the religious reform was a starting point. Why? The separation from clergy in approaching God. In other words, individuals got to contact directly with God. That's the beginning of the individuals in the Western culture. And then we went through Renaissance, where they internalize the individual values. Korea, did Korea go through that? Absolutely nonsense. Privatism, because neo-familial group, so small, so situation. In other words, neo-familialism is not, it's a dynamic thing, in a sense. It's not a state set. It's situation, it's a dynamic. Its unit is so small that it looks like individualism. No. Neo-familial groups, so exclusive value. If you do not belong to your group, you're nothing, almost nothing. Okay? How could you call that individualism? That's nonsense. I don't understand this irresponsible way of understanding their own society. Frankly, okay. I mean, trust whatever they learned from the West. They try to impose what they learned from the West upon Korean society. That's me. Sorry if I'm too much passionate about this, but I cannot help it. So please understand. That's why I long flew over here. So okay. So individualism versus pragmatism, to me, it's a critical distinction to understand what's going on in Korea. Okay? That's why even I say determining operating unit, social unit, meaning we should open mind to the emergence of social groupings as a consequence of industrialization. Okay, so but then last point, international relations. So what happened? How has successful late industrialization been changing Korean perspective of international relations? This aspect has never been studied in the current field of study. Okay? For example, democracy. I think Korean democracy should have civilization significance. I'm not exaggerating because I'm Korean national. No, absolutely not. Why? Have you ever seen such a case like South Korea in the world, where totally Asian way, Korean way of civilization, but totally Western with the democratic institution? There's a certain contradiction. So the way I look at the Korean current status of Korean democracy is that we should take a longer perspective. In other words, I regard the Korean democracy as on the way to identify, to find Korean style of democracy. Finally, under Park Chung-hee, he kept talking about Korean style democracy. Now I differentiate myself from Park Chung-hee by saying in Korean language, Park Chung-hee, 한국 democracy, I say 한국형 democracy to differentiate myself from Park Chung-hee. So we should take a long perspective. If you look at the French history, it took almost a century until the Third Republic, as we discussed yesterday. So we're only 40 years now. So I think for example, candlelight demonstration. Whenever I look at the candlelight demonstrations, I think Korean constitution should change to reflect more direct democracy into constitution. I have a distinct the feeling that should happen, that might be happening. In other words, why? Because there's a very little connection, almost similar to what happened to primary society. Korean society now very weak connection between political parties and the rest of society. Okay? That gap has been filled by candlelight demonstration. Okay? So when I take a long-term perspective of candlelight demonstration, I think eventually Korean constitution, Korean democracy will continue more direct participation among people, rather than supplementing indirect democracy. So we have to understand also democracy as a strategic weapon of Korean diplomacy. Okay? In other words, there's too much distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy in Korean foreign relations. I have maintained a new concept, identity-based Korean foreign policy. Identity. Okay? In other words, we should let ourselves known to other people first before we talk about policy. Okay? So I say now, Korean society, many, sporadic policy ideas, not vision. So I said one time over Zoom meeting, Korean society, I call it policy state, not vision state. So here and there, many people from different, let's say, European experiences, the American experience, Japan. So they issue their own perspective in terms of policies, but altogether, what's the vision? That's one vision. Only policy. Not if you put them together, no vision. All right. So let me now make some broad observation before I conclude the shortly. Sorry about this. Am I taking too long? I hope not. Okay. So I think Korean society have been too much fragmented. We have been living too long, too much with a false perception of ethnic homogeneity. Under this kind of ethnic homogeneity, the socially Korean society has been very much fragmented. We have to admit that. So the image that I draw upon based on my research, Tadaway image. Tadaway means the field in northern Europe or the Seattle Valley, the Peterson, Seattle area. If you look at the Korean southern part of the southern sea, if you look from the sky, everything connected, right? The closer you come down to the land, you begin to see how separate Tadaway island nature. Okay? So that's a static structural image of Korean society that I characterize, Tadaway image. But then boiling hot bubbles, that's dynamic aspect. In other words, when I watch the boiling pot, the bubbles comes up and easily pop, right? Each bubble try to get out, right? Something, but before they got the top, they pop. So that's the dynamic image that I characterize Korean society. Okay, right. The last one I will emphasize, harnessing that I already explained. So let me go to lost sense of community in the second. I recently examined the Park Jae-in Samao Undong. To me, that's a totally misunderstood. They regard as success in what sense? In the sense of, let's say, improving living conditions of rural villages. Yes, I admit that. But did it create a new sense of community? Absolutely nonsense. Okay. So I read almost everything about Park Jae-in's writings. My conclusion is Park Jae-in lost the opportunity to create the modern sense of community in the industrial setting, like Japan or even Germany, something. In other words, he tried to substitute some of it for creating new community. Even worse was Samadongdong Ponbu, the central headquarters of Samadongdong. That kind of gave us false perception, false understanding that something must have done. Absolutely nothing. Okay. So one of the critical, also fundamental reason why Korean society is suffering, to me, is failure to establish new sense of a community in industrial setting. For example, greetings, Korean greetings. If you go to Korea, still they use the same old the insult greeting patterns in rural village. Korean society has not been able to coin hello, for example. There's no counterpart in Korean language to hello. Okay. So hello originally means I was told I don't have any hostility to you. That's the original meaning of hello. But then in Korea, you just pass by each other without saying anything. That's why I mean, foreigners, when they visit Korea, they feel strange, but my point here is that under the false sense of a community based upon ethnic homogeneity, Korea has living too much without reinventing a new sense of community in industrialization. To me, that's a fundamental source of sort of now problem. More specifically, originally, Park failed to establish new sense of community, but then without new community, Korea also had to go through colonization. So colonization means sort of uncritical, unmassive importation of international standards to Korea, right? And then further complicating Korean society. For example, if you go to Korea now, young people kiss each other on the streets, right? It caught my heart, frankly. I mean, that's their privilege, but I bet every Koreans have different feeling about it. Okay, yeah. Although they don't say outright openly. Living in America, I seldom see that kind of kissing scene even in American streets right now. Right? This is a small example, but what I'm saying is that total lack of any consensus on any day. I presided back to say as privileged professor in Korea many times, but no longer I cannot do that. I cannot do that anymore. Why? I cannot satisfy two families. So just many anecdotes, but my overall point is that why Korean people are suffering now in Korea exactly? They cannot relate to each other. Okay? That's a very sad story. Okay? But the only comforting point that I make is that modernity it's kind of very convoluted process. It takes a long time. Okay? Since we Korean people constantly think that our economy develops so quickly, so politically, societally, we should be able to be on the par with the level of economy. No, that's not the case. Okay? So as I said, since the French Revolution, it took almost 100 years before they settled down with their own system. And then Korean society, as I said, what has been going on in Korean society has international civilization significance. Okay? That's why Korea case is important. Probably that's one of the reasons why I changed to Korean study from Soviet study. Okay? So I stop here and I'm happy to listen to you. Thanks very much.